Let's talk about unitization. So unitization is what happens when you want to have a uniform plan for all the owners of oil in a given reservoir to come together and figure out what the best way is to produce all that oil in the reservoir. And there might be a lot of different ways depending on that reservoir. Maybe it makes sense for all the wells to be in one place and there to be wells in another place that sort of inject water or gas to push the oil over to the well location. Or maybe it makes sense to have wells in several locations. A lot can depend on the shape of the reservoir. So here's a very simplistic drawing of a reservoir. This is one without gas. So this is one where you just have water drive. So what you can see here is you have the oil trapped up against that cap rock, and then you have water underneath that's pushing it up. And there would be a lot of different ways to produce this oil, but you can imagine injecting more water in here to push the oil out of a well right at the top here, but there's a lot of different ways that you could do that. Now, as I said in earlier classes, it usually is the case that in the United States, unitization is not something that happens before there's any production. Even though that might be more efficient, it might be more efficient to just start with a systematic plan to develop the whole reservoir. Instead, it's something that's used when all of the old oil wells are trailing off in their production. And to sweep out that last oil, you need to unitize and work together to inject water. So typically the way that it works in the United States is there's a lot of development according to those drilling and spacing rules that you're aware of, and that sort of fills out our knowledge of that reservoir, how big it is, where a lot of the oil is located, and then once we have all that knowledge and the oil production starts to trail off, landowners come together to unitize that reservoir and get the last oil out of it. So here's a little bit more complicated version of the same picture. You can see this is a reservoir that has both a gas cap and an oil production. And what you could see here is if you had some sort of simple field rules, you might get a number of wells, all across this reservoir producing. And at first, they would produce different things depending where they were located in the reservoir. So you would have oil at these wells that were just located, were producing that oil, which is pictured in the darkest color here. So you have two wells that are just producing oil. Then you have one well here in the middle that's right down into that gas cap, so it's producing the gas. Great to sell that natural gas. The problem, obviously, is that you're pulling off that gas cap, and that means that there's less pressure down on the oil, pushing it out to your neighbors. So as we saw in that Oklahoma case, there might be limits on you producing that gas if the conservation agency is concerned that that will reduce production from the oil wells. So you can see that depending on where those wells are, they might produce different things. Another thing you could notice here is maybe this well right here used to produce oil, but as that oil was drained away, now all it's getting is water, what's on the bottom. So that's just producing water now. That should be shut in, because if you're taking away that water, then you're removing what is causing the oil to go to the surface. So that's not great. You can see the other two wells that I haven't yet circled, those are kind of mixed cases. They're right at the surface. This one's right at the surface of oil and gas, so it's producing a mix of oil and gas, and we might want to shut it in if it's producing too much gas, which would remove our gas cap, and so therefore lower our production of oil. And then this one right here is right at the mix of water underneath and the oil on top, and so it's producing a mix of water and oil. And again, we might want to shut it down if it's producing too much water, and so therefore getting rid of our reservoir drive. So seems like one very simple way of unitizing this property would be for all these 6 wells, imagine they're owned by 6 different parties, to come together and come up with a plan for producing the rest of that oil. And maybe one plan would be, let's shoot some gas down that well that was producing gas. Let's shut it in, stop producing gas, and start shooting down gas. We could shoot natural gas, or we could put just carbon dioxide. Different gases are sometimes used. This well that's just producing water on the right, let's shoot water down that, and that will push that oil out. Similarly, these two that are mixed, let's probably turn them into injection wells as well. Shoot gas down the one on top and shoot water down this. And that will hopefully push the remaining oil out our two good wells here and here, so we get the rest of that oil. So that's why you might want to unitize a formation. You can think about operating it as a unit is what would happen if one person owned that. So if these 6 wells all belong to one person, they would probably do exactly this: turn some of them into injection and leave some of them producing that last oil. So when we operate as a unit, we do what one owner would do if they had the choice to do that. So we basically operate as a unit to maximize overall production. Now, what we'll see is that's going to be very complicated. And I think you can start to imagine how complicated it would be to get all these owners to agree if you ask yourself, well, of all these 6 different owners, how much would each of them want of the ultimate oil production? Because you can imagine for the 2 wells that are still producing oil, they might think, well, we should get all of the oil left because these other people aren't really producing oil anymore. Or maybe they've got like a little bit mixed with gas or water, but it's going to go away soon. So we should get almost all the oil. On the other hand, the other landowners might say, hey, well, if you want us to stop and turn it into an injection well, we need a big share. So those negotiations can be very complex, as we'll see. Please remember, throughout this, it's important to always use this clarification. Pooling, right, which we've talked about and will continue to talk about throughout the semester, is very common even at the first stages of oil production, because pooling is just getting enough land together for a single well. Okay, so often it's let's just get enough acreage for a single 80-acre or 40-acre drilling unit. So pooling is very common from the start. What we're talking about now is unitization, which is bringing together several wells over an entire formation. And that in the United States usually only happens after there's been years of production and production is winding down and you want to get that last oil out of the ground. If you look internationally, you would see that it's more common to require unitization from the beginning, but in the US, we usually just allow the normal production until oil is winding down, and then the landowners come together to see if they can negotiate a unitization. So let's talk about a case about how complicated these equities can be in unitization cases. This one's from Nebraska from 1969, and it's on page 835 in your books. So Nebraska unitizes a field for water flooding. So just as we've talked about, let's have a unitized field where we turn some of the old oil wells into injection wells, injecting water down to push that last oil out. The problem here is that Baumgartner, the plaintiff, declined to join the unit. So he said his land was excluded because he didn't join it. And what we'll see is that in many states, you can't necessarily be forced into a unit if you don't want to. Texas is one of those. Texas does not have mandatory unitization. So there can be holdouts, like this plaintiff here in Nebraska, Baumgartner. So his land was excluded. And he said, okay, yeah, my land has been excluded, but I want to drill another well. And he says, if I drill that well, I think it can earn me $12,000. I'll spend a lot of money on the well, but I'll get enough oil that I'll have a $12,000 net profit after paying for that well. The problem is that the Oil and Gas Commission denied that request. They said you don't get to drill a well, and we'll see why that is. So if you look at the map that's on page 837 in your book, you can start to get a little sense of why this dispute arose. So here's the reservoir. You can see everything that's within, it's kind of like a peanut-shaped reservoir. And if you look, everything here in highlights has been unitized. So almost everyone has agreed to operate as a team. And their plan is, let's put some injection wells around the edges, and we will bring all that oil to the middle where we can produce it. Problem is, the plaintiff right here, they just have that little corner of the reservoir, and they're not agreeing to join the unit. So what does the plaintiff want to do? Well, the plaintiff says, oh, that's wonderful that you are turning your wells into water injection wells and pushing all the oil to the middle. Because I'm not quite in the middle, but as that oil gets pushed, some of it's going to go through my property, by my tract. And while you do that, I'm going to drill down and take that oil. Now, you can imagine why the Conservation Commission didn't want the plaintiff to be able to do that, to be able to sort of take advantage of the injection wells that everybody else was using. So when the plaintiff asked for that well, the Conservation Commission said no, said you don't get that well. In the meantime, all that oil was pushed initially through the plaintiff's property, but then ultimately to just into the middle, and it was produced there. So there's no more oil left on the plaintiff's property, and the plaintiff sues. Plaintiff says, look, I could have drilled this well and made $12,000. But you know what? It's even worse than that, because you injected water that ultimately, first it pushed the oil onto my land, but then it pushed the oil off of my land. So really, you injected water onto my land. That's a trespass. And you pushed $90,000 of oil first onto my land and then off of it. And when you pushed $90,000 of oil off my land, that's a trespass. So yeah, it might have cost me, $78,000, $80,000 to produce it. But if you trespass and take some valuable property from me, then I get all that money. You don't get to set off and say, well, it would have cost you a lot of money to produce. So I want all $90,000 in oil paid to me. And the district court agrees with that. So the district court says, yeah, this is a trespass. You put something on the plaintiff's property. You pushed water onto the plaintiff's property, and that pushed $90,000 of oil off of his property. Now, true, you push the oil onto his property too by these injection wells, but the point is you can't trespass, push water on his property, and push that oil off. So you're liable for trespass, that's $90,000. What happens here is the Supreme Court of Nebraska rejects that. And they say, that doesn't make any sense. At most here, the plaintiff should have gotten $12,000. And the reason they say is because it's not, we don't use these technical trespass doctrines when what's really happening is going on deep below the earth. So it's not like somebody broke into your house and took $90,000 of oil. And we also have to consider the necessity for unitization to get the most out of these old fields. And so we don't want to treat that as a trespass, and we're not going to. So go ahead and sue and say you needed a well. If you can prove you needed a well, then you get to have the profits that you would have had from drilling that well. So maybe you would have produced $90,000 in oil, but you would have had to spend $80,000 on the well, or $78,000. So the maximum you could have received is $12,000. Okay? Now the dissent says this is all nonsense. We should be allowing unitization. We want to encourage it. This plaintiff, if there hadn't been water flooding, if they hadn't unitized, would never have gotten any oil The only reason there was oil on this plaintiff's property after all these years of production was because these injection wells pushed it under the plaintiff's property. So there should be no recovery at all for this plaintiff. So you can see how complicated it can be to use sort of our traditional property rules and our traditional rules of oil production and then apply them to this circumstance of unitization. One of the justifications that the court gives here is it points to this decision from Texas on unitization. It says, this is the Manziel case, a very famous case from Texas, 1962. If to prevent waste, protect correlative rights, or in the exercise of its other powers, the commission authorizes secondary recovery projects, a trespass does not occur when the injected secondary recovery forces move across lease lines. So those forces, the water or the gas that you've injected down, when that's being injected deep under the earth, that's not a trespass. We don't use the technical trespass rules. Court continues. The technical rules of trespass have no place in the consideration of the validity of the orders of the commission. So in other words, yeah, there's some water and gas going underneath your property. Yes, you own from heaven to hell, but we're not going to apply those technical rules in this special circumstance where we're trying to encourage unitization. Okay, so let's return to this example. We have 6 different owners. They're all producing different things. 2 are producing oil, and then the rest are producing a mix of gas, water, or oil and water, or oil and gas. And they're trying to come together and negotiate a unitization plan. Well, it's going to be really tough to figure out how they should share that oil and gas. And I'm just going to list several of those reasons that it's so hard to reach a decision on how to allocate the production from that unit. So, of course, one reason is that every reservoir is different. And they're different from, even within the reservoir, they can be different from place to place in terms of what's being produced. So, in that picture I gave you, yeah, it looks very complicated how you would allocate it. But in reality, it's even more complicated because you don't have this clean picture of where the oil and gas is and who's getting it. So in fact, every reservoir is different and you have imperfect information about where exactly that oil and gas is located and who will be able to produce oil and gas in the future if you don't unitize and if you do unitize. Okay. Secondly, the parties aren't homogeneous. So some of them might have an interest in, hey, let's just ride this as long as we can. We don't want to unitize. I want money today. Others might say, you know what, I'm willing to shut this in for a bit to figure out how to do this best to give us the most money eventually. The leases might not be identical. So in each of these parties, there's a couple different interests. There's the interest of the oil and gas company that's operating it, and there's the interest of the landowner. And we'll see those interests can be very different throughout the rest of the course. We'll be talking about how sometimes the oil and gas company might have a different interest than the landowner whose land is being produced. The reserves are also heterogeneous, so they're all different. That's what that word means, heterogeneous. So there can be variable porosity, so there can be different amount of space, pores. Porosity, you'll remember, the amount of space in that rock where oil and gas can be stored. They can be different thickness, different permeability, which means the ability of oil and gas to flow through that rock. So yeah, variable permeability. The reservoir could be thicker in some places than others. You'll remember that Pickens case where he said, oh, the reservoir is really thick under me, so I should get more of the production. Some areas may produce longer than others. So remember in that chart, you can imagine those 2 oil wells, they might keep producing for a while, even if they don't unitize. So what's their incentive to unitize? And some areas may yield a more efficient recovery. So maybe the place that is producing oil, it would actually be better to produce in another place that's producing a mix of oil and gas right now. The parties, as we said, are very different. Some might have a head start. They might have been producing for a while, and and other parties may think, well, I should be allowed to catch up and produce more since they've had a head start. Some might know more about the reservoir. So you're having this negotiation with imperfect information about how much each party should get, and some parties may be withholding information about what the reservoir really looks like. Some might have a greater percentage of interest, so that landowner could have a bigger share of production in its royalty, and there could be a lot of different landowners and oil companies involved. And there can be different interests in existing facilities. One thing we'll talk about is some people might say, hey, you're going to use my oil well for injection now. Well, you need to pay me some of the cost of that well. And of course, even if you have the same information about the reservoir, it's imperfect. You might have different theories about what it looked like. You'll remember in that Pickens case, the Railroad Commission and Pickens had different theories about how that reservoir was going to be produced. Finally, you might have had already a lot of disagreements with these neighbors because you might think they're stealing your oil or they have been for years. So sometimes that negotiation kind of starts off on the wrong foot. Of course, as I mentioned, those lease terms are heterogeneous. They're all different. There can be different conditions in the lease that determine how the oil and gas company has to act. There may be different provisions in the lease about whether the oil and gas company itself can negotiate a unitization. And then there can be lots of different terms about royalties or other fiscal terms that may give the oil companies and the landowners operating those, the landowners who own those wells and the oil companies operating them, different interests. And we'll talk about how all those different interests may make some oil companies more eager to produce or less eager to produce later in the course. Parties also have to consider whether they should give credit for previous work done. If you spend a lot of money on oil wells that are now going to be used for injection, should you get some credit for that? They'll have to think about if there needs to be any more work done to understand the reservoir, to figure out how best to produce it. They'll have to think about allocation of cost for certain projects that might provide a benefit both to areas within the reservoir and to parts off of it. So if there's storage that's going to be used by some people off of that unit reservoir, how are they going to allocate the costs of that? Or transport, pipelines, or any other thing? How do they allocate those costs? And of course, the major thing is, how do you allocate the amount of oil remaining that you're able to produce? Sometimes you'll also want to have a redetermination process, because in the unitization, as it begins operating, you may learn a lot more about where that oil was initially. Do you want to adjust for that and allow, if new information reveals that a lot of the oil was really on just one party's property, should their share then be boosted? How are you going to determine that, and what's going to be the process? And of course, parties will also want to think about tax consequences in terms of when they take income and depreciation, make investments. These are very important considerations in practice for these parties. So you can see how complicated it can be to reach one of these unitization agreements. The only other thing I would say is that when you're looking at unitization, there's a couple important things to keep in mind. One is, in your book, it talks about how each state has different rules about how you unitize. As I said, in Texas, it's got to be voluntary. There's no mandatory unitization. But in some places, you just need to have a certain percentage of either the owners of the oil and gas or the owners and the companies that are operating that come together to reach an agreement, and they can force unwilling owners into that unit. So that just depends on the state. The other thing that's talked about in your book, and I think you should keep in mind, is even in places where the Oil and Gas Commission doesn't have technical authority to force unitization, they can sometimes encourage it. And that's because the Oil and Gas and Conservation Commissions usually have some kind of authority to shut down production, or at least reduce production in a field where they think the reservoir is being damaged. So even if a state doesn't have the authority to mandate unitization, they might be able to say, you know what, nobody's producing anything until there's a way of producing it that doesn't damage this reservoir. Or they can say, all production is cut in half. By the way, if you came up with a way to produce it more efficiently, we'd probably let you go do that. So even in places where there's technically no authority to mandate unitization, the state can sometimes encourage it by aggressive use of its authority over production allowables.